At 40-something, who would still stand beside you if the crown slipped and the room turned cold? In the damp hush of Berkeley, Edward II learned the oldest lesson of midlife. Vows fade faster than breath on stone. The corridor smelled of rushes and old smoke, a lamp guttered, the night pressed in like a verdict no one dared read aloud. Letters had been burned, names softened into silence, and every footstep carried the hush of men paid to forget. Was the last comfort loyalty, prayer, or habit? He remembered a tilt-yard's cheers, a hand clasped too tightly, a council table where smiles were thin as knives. If a king is a mirror, what was now reflected, dignity or a man pared down to fear? To understand why a sovereign could be left to such shadows, we must walk backward through the years, past the triumphs that never settled and the friendships that grew into storms, to the first hairline cracks in a seemingly unassailable crown. Edward II was born to Longshank's iron legacy, yet he wore power like a tunic cut for someone else, never quite fitting at the shoulders. He preferred music to muster rolls, fellowship to cold arithmetic, and in Piers Gaskin he found both laughter and relief. Favor, once given, multiplied. Offices, grants, a seat too near the throne. Lords who had bled for Edward's father now watched the new warmth at court and felt winter settle in their bones. Was this friendship, they asked, or an eclipse? Markets murmured, chapels whispered, the kingdom felt tilted, as though a hidden weight had shifted on the scales. When storms came, the clatter of failing campaigns, petitions turned protests, levies questioned, the court's tender center looked like weakness, not grace. What leader forgets that affection invites envy, and envy sharpens into policy? By the time admonitions became threats, the habit of indulgence was set. A crown can forgive many flaws, it cannot forgive the sense that it might be ignored, and so the first cracks widened. When Piers faded from the center, another star rose, Hugh Despenser, the keen-eyed gatherer of rights and rents, whom later pens call Hugh Despenser. He understood how to turn royal favor into title deeds, how to stitch the coast to his purse with legal thread, a patent here, a wardship there, and soon the map itself looked edited. Marcher lords woke to find an old oath costing them a new estate. One baron's keep, once a family spine, was reassigned by daylight, the charter smooth as a blade. How many gifts can one man hold, grumbled the shires, before the basket breaks? The question mattered because each grant was a message, the king's nearness, the king's trust, the king's shield. But nearness breeds shadows. Envoys returned with cool eyes, councils stalled over grievances that sounded like inventories. If a realm is a balance, where do you set a weight so heavy and expect the scale to hold? Edward, tired of suspicion, clung harder, common in midlife, when storms make us value the one fixed star. Yet fixed stars can blind sailors. Resentments, once private, learned to march in files. Petitions marched with them. Beyond the palace lamps, village porches whispered the same refrain. Favor had outshouted fairness. And when fairness goes unheard, what listens next is steel. Across the channel, Isabella of France learned to speak in the grammar of patience. She smiled where others scowled, wrote where others shouted. Her letters traveled like careful footsteps, each one avoiding puddles that could splash scandal. In her orbit moved Roger Mortimer in sterner ledgers, who could read the weather of men. Between the Queen's frost and Morton's fire, a plan condensed, not a thunderclap, but a steady rain. Ships were hired that looked like traders. Banners stayed folded until land was certain. What begins as a visit became a verdict. England's coast, used to royal processions, now watched a smaller procession with larger intent. Towns opened their gates less from love than from arithmetic. If a door must swing, better it swing early. Edward, startled by the speed of absence, courtiers, then captains, moved west into the wet folds of Wales. He carried not treasure but habit, the belief that tomorrow's council would mend today's fray. But tomorrow had new chairs. Where is loyalty measured, a clerk asked, in hymns or in harvests? The answer came in cold ink, proclamations that named a regency, and the softest cruelty of all, the feeling that home was now elsewhere. The counterstroke came not as a roar, but as a shrug from the land itself. Doors unbarred for others, roads suddenly longer for the king. On the Severn, the tide ran like a sly accountant, subtracting options one by one. Edward's party, thin, tired, hollowed by rain, threaded the marsh paths where reeds rasped like whispers that wouldn't commit to words. A shepherd stared and looked away. Even pity feared the price of being seen. The baggage was memory more than gear. A signet's cool oval, the remembered cadence of a council prayer, the ache of names no longer safe to say aloud. Night after night, the same arithmetic. If we cut west, we meet a swollen ford. If we turn north, we meet a closed gate. If we linger, news travels faster than horses. In a ruined byre, the king slept sitting up, as if posture alone could preserve a headline that had already changed. At dawn came the certain sound, bits rattling, orders spoken like receipts. Captured is a simple word. The moment felt more intricate. A hand on a bridle, a nod exchanged among men who had once bowed before him. There was no speech, just the soft profession of custody. The crown's weight slid off without ceremony, and the day grew suddenly quiet, like a room after a clock is stopped. He did not rage. Midlife teaches a man how to fold anger into breath and keep walking. Berkeley received him with the politeness of stone. The chamber smelled of damp lime and old wool. The arrow slit watched a square of indifferent sky. Custody hardened into routine. Bread at the same hour, a brazier that smoked more than it warmed, guards whose faces learned the discipline of blankness. Some nights the wind lifted from the Severn and set the shutters tapping. Some nights a fox barked and sounded like a human trying to remember courage. Rumor, quicker than light, threaded the corridors, of a method that leaves little to read upon the skin, of heat used not for mercy but for disguise. The talk never rose above a murmur, yet it pressed on the ribs like a weight placed there by an unseen hand. Edward prayed, but not only as a king. He prayed as a husband who had misread distance, as a father who wanted his son to keep what he could not hold. He touched the wall and felt the slow patience of masonry. In midlife we discover which silences shelter us and which swallow us whole. Here the silence had a craft to it, practical as a locksmith. Messages arrived, brief, bloodless, careful with verbs, and hinted at futures drafted by others. He slept lightly, woke at small sounds, and measured hope in thimblefuls. Outside, the world behaved itself. Markets opened, bells rang. Inside, a clock without hands counted down in warmth and breath, waiting for someone to decide what would not be written. The announcement came with a tidy hush, as if grief had been scheduled between market hours. A clerk read the words the way one reads weather, solemn, impersonal, already past. Couriers moved like stitches through cloth, binding counties to a single version of events. In Berkeley's chapel, the body lay beneath scented linen, lavender working hard to persuade the air of peace. Faces approached, peered, and withdrew. The skin showed nothing a sermon could not explain. The coroner's ink behaved itself. Witnesses remembered only what decency allowed. A guard was reassigned to a far coast. Another found himself wealthy enough to leave questions behind. Doors opened and closed without creak, as if oiled by good intentions. Yet the narrative wore a sheen too perfect, like wax that hides the grain of wood. Why so swift a notice? Why so few firm nouns where history prefers them? Rumor, rebuked in daylight, rehearsed itself at night, a method that reveals nothing, a flame used to erase footprints rather than rooms. The kingdom learned the etiquette of not asking. Even the bells sounded cautious, as if each strike might be taken down and quoted. In such climates, truth does not vanish. It goes to ground. It waits in attics and cellars, in letters folded twice. In the memory of a boy who watched grown men avoid each other's eyes, power returned to Westminster wearing two faces. Isabeau's measured winter and Morton's capable spring. Decrees were tidy, taxes argued into compliance, justice dressed in fresh paint. Yet the floorboards listened. A government can act boldly and still hear the echo of a corridor at Berkeley. Councils began with prayer and ended with arithmetic. How many lords to appease? How many sheriffs to replace? How many stories to keep unspoken? The young Edward III stood at ceremonies like a candle that had not yet been lit. He learned the grammar of patience, the art of nodding while measuring shadows. The regent's strength was real, but it moved with the wariness of someone carrying a full bowl across a crowded hall. They preferred victories that left few splinters. Land restored here, a charter confirmed there, a rebel welcomed back under certain terms. Still, whispers traveled faster than laws. A tale of a king wronged, of a death too neat, made excellent company on winter roads. To rule amid such murmurs is to balance on threads. You say stability, The shire's here until further notice. You say order, the guild's here for now. What sustains a realm is not fear alone, but the calm sense that tomorrow is legible. The Regency wrote tomorrow in careful script, knowing that one blot might show where the quill had trembled. Edward III studied power the way a locksmith studies hinges, by listening. He had watched the Regency smile through clenched arithmetic, had watched men lower their voices when his father's name brushed the air. He had learned, too, the speed at which daylight can be rearranged by ink. On an autumn night at Nottingham, when the castle's stones still held the day's warmth, the lesson ripened. A postern door, a passage kept quiet by custom, the soft shock of turning where others think you cannot. This is how a page becomes a chapter. He moved with a small company, the kind that does not clear its throat. In a chamber bright with guarded ease, Morton found that the future had arrived without knocking. There were no speeches to gild it, only the plain grammar of arrest and a crown reclaiming its own verbs. The Queen Mother looked at a son already taller than the story that had been written for him. What debt does a child owe to the past, and what debt is paid by ending it? He did not answer aloud. He knew that kingdoms prefer deeds that can fit inside a chronicle line. In the days that followed, doors changed their habits. Men whose names had been nouns became past tense. The realm felt the long exhale of a hall where a heavy guest has at last departed. Yet the air still remembered another presence, one that could not be made to bow, the quiet absence of a father who had taught him, without meaning to, that mercy and delay are cousins who seldom agree. What, then, of Berkeley and the method that history repeats with a wince? The archives are courteous. They offer parchment, officials, the fragrance of lawful sorrow. The tale is less polite. It insists on a device designed to leave no proof, a story that feels both too perfect and too purposeful. Was it truth, or the logic of enemies dressing vengeance as morality? A rumor answers needs that documents cannot. It explains why witnesses looked away, why a realm forgot to ask. Perhaps Edward died by a quieter cruelty, and the more lurid script was inked later to tutor princes through fear. Or perhaps the hush at Berkeley was precisely the point. Either way, the lesson survives the footnotes. A throne is not only a seat, it is a mirror. Favor can warp the image, neglect can frost it over. And when the glass shatters, the shards keep reflecting. In midlife, we learn that reputations are written not in grand strokes, but in the rooms where no one breathes too loudly, the study, the council, the cell. Edward II left one such room behind, and England carried it forward like a folded letter. Open it in any century, and the same draft lifts from the page. Love that became leverage, power afraid of its own reflection, silence doing the last, meticulous work.